Welcome to the Roniel and DaRon podcast show. I'm Roniel.
I'm DaRon.
In the last episode, we talked about the non-technical mistakes, and today we're going to talk about the technical mistakes that we made in our career. So let you start off, DaRon, by telling us some of the mistakes that you've seen in your career, technically wise.
Sure. So I actually want to give first a real quick short story. Back in 2008, I think it was, I was doing an engagement at a government installation, and I wound up hijacking the entire network. So I had all of the traffic go through me before it went anywhere else across the whole installation. And I had done this on purpose, and it actually yielded a lot of great data. I was a little over, I think, an hour and a half into it before anyone noticed. And what wound up happening was, unfortunately, I had a minor misconfiguration for one of the networks that was causing a denial of service on one of their wireless guest networks, so that anyone who was on that network couldn't go anywhere, couldn't do anything. I still got their traffic, but I was failing to properly forward that specific network's traffic. And that's how they wound up finding out what was going on. Or let me rephrase it. That's how they found out that something was going on. And they, of course, immediately contacted us. And that actually created a little bit of a kerfuffle. And the reason why that happened was because I had managed to, through this, steal all the credentials of everyone high up at this installation. So everyone who was worth anything, and that included the people in charge of security as well as the people in charge of the installation itself. And we hadn't really notified them that this was going to happen. I was in charge of a specific aspect of this penetration test. Actually, I was in charge of overseeing the whole thing. But we had two separate teams operating on the installation at the time. And it wound up creating a little bit of a political situation, especially because through that campaign, I had managed to steal credentials on a lot of people, and they wanted to see some of these credentials, but I couldn't hand them over for a variety of reasons, to include a lot of the credentials were not saying great things about the workplace environment, shall we say. They included words like hellhole.
Really?
Yes.
No, man, that's
serious.
horrible.
That's serious. And of course, this is all tied to the different usernames and everything else. And I was actively using this to do my thing across the network even further. And, I had all of the admin credentials for all of the network devices because, of course, they had automated network sensors and things of that nature that were logging into these different devices constantly. So I was man in the middling all of that. It was actually a big deal. Now, it was funny because this did create a big storm at first, especially because I had stolen the CIO and CISO's credentials. And that's a great way to get yourself kicked off an installation pretty quickly. We actually were asked to leave. we were asked to leave. They did invite us back after about an hour and a half. And they asked a lot of questions. Of course, the first question when they first found out was, who authorized this? And of course, I'm sitting there going, well, it wasn't barred. It was in the rules of engagement. So I had done everything I had done was okay, but I had also wound up doing this to some of the mission critical stuff. Nothing wound up getting delayed except for, like I said, the guest wireless. And no, it was one of those no harm, no foul kind of things because it was only guest wireless that was impacted. But I would say importantly, what happened here was, number one, my direct manager stuck by me and stuck by what I had done. And we actually picked up extra work from this. because something else I had done was I'd done in the same engagement SQL injection to a backend SQL server that bypassed the firewall and allowed me to hit the backend database. And what I did using that SQL injection was a bunch of connect scans to map out that internal network that I couldn't gain access to. And then I managed to log into the router and reconfigure it all through the just straight SQL injection because I couldn't drop a shell on the SQL server. And once I opened up the firewall, I managed to get a reverse shell and all that good stuff. But what wound up coming of all of this was this particular organization then actually asked specifically for me and me only to provide them training and to give them all the data as to what I did, how I did it, how they could prevent it, and how they could detect it, things of that nature. So it's interesting from the perspective of what was initially taken very poorly. They were very unhappy. When, number one, I handled it well, and number two, my management stuck by me and handled it well. They didn't leave me out to, just toss around in the wind. And that allowed me to parlay it from, oh, you shouldn't have done this, to, we're so glad that you did, and we want you to come and do more. And actually, I wound up having a lengthy engagement specifically for me to train them, to provide them with policies, procedures, and guidelines, standards, et cetera, for how they can do better, how they can better detect this stuff, how they can better secure their network, tied to application security specifically. And this was way ahead of the curve because application security back in 2007, 2008 was like almost non-existent. It was almost completely network security. So my point there being, if you ever have what seems like a huge mistake, first and foremost, good management is going to ensure that lessons are learned. But good management will also ensure that you're shielded appropriately. If my management had left me out to dry, it may have been a very different situation.
Right.
But because of the way I handled it, because of the way I presented myself, and the way that my management handled it and presented themselves, instead, we actually got a lot of extra money thrown at us to help secure their system. And it was interesting because in this same engagement, remember how I said there were two teams operating at the same time? Well, the second team made a critical error, and it was not handled the same. They accidentally created a denial of service because they were running Nmap on a firewall that was misconfigured. And they should not have been scanning this system because this was a mission critical system. And they actually DOSed the network. The firewall just spazzed out and went down. And the people in charge of that engagement, both in the field and then, of course, back at our office, completely bungled it. And the customer was absolutely livid because this was at a critical time during an actual mission. You do not want to, because you're talking big, huge money if lives were lost, or if many millions of dollars worth of equipment were lost, or if the operation itself had failed as a direct result of this error. When the truth is, if they had spun it appropriately, what they would have focused on was, yes, it was my fault, I shouldn't have scanned it, but this is a critical vulnerability. What if the Chinese or Russians had done this? What if someone created an application that accidentally did something like this? And that's something to always remember. These benevolent users are some of the most dangerous users there are. everyone talks about malicious users, right? And those, of course, are your attackers and malicious employees, nation states, all of that good stuff. But your benevolent users, the people who aren't trying to do you harm, those include people who are curious, but it also includes people who just screw up. Your application developer screws up and they write code that accidentally creates a denial of service. Well, there was no malice involved, so they're not malicious, but it's very common. It's incredibly common. And really the difference in how management handled it and how the team lead in charge of the engagements handled it actually made all the difference in the response from the customer. So I got offered to come back. A contract was made specifically for me. The other group got kicked off the base and banned.
Wow.
Same organization on both sides.
Well, that's very interesting. From my perspective, it was a little different than this is when I was a security engineer. As I told you, we used to deal with big data, or data would come in, and we would need to make sure the data coming in was secure, and it would get transferred to something locally, with like a VHG. So that whole process was set up. I was one of the ones that set up and built that whole thing and how the process go. I managed all of that. So when people would come in, I would teach them how the system works, how it was built, and where we're going. And I also wrote documentation for that. So there was 2 incidents that happened, but it also helped us in these 2 incidents. So the one incident, this guy comes in, he was an intern. As an intern, he did a few things, did a little pen testing, just a little bit. And one of my big tasks was to make sure at the time he understood how that process that we built went, because that was our main job, besides, reading logs all day and all that other shit. But that was our main job. So basically, I was showing the kid the processes that we do for sending data back and forth and how to secure it. And I bring up to my boss that in upper management that this was going to be an issue, because we had a one-way server that we set up, and then we had a two-way server that we set up. And basically through the one-way access, it was kind of hard. You couldn't separate who could do what. So there was folders set up, and if somebody dropped data into the wrong folder that belonged to another company, that would be a real big HIPAA violation, right?
Right.
So one day somebody did that. And it was like a few years, like maybe when I was in like 3 years by now, I think it's on my 3rd year. And this guy goes through and I think we were using Slack at then, or HipChat, and literally in this one channel, it was everybody. I'm talking about CEOs, board, everybody. And he literally goes in there and pings everybody saying that we messed up, we screwed up, we violated PHI, we put the wrong stuff in here, we as a team messed up, and we need to fix this and blah, blah, blah. Instead of coming to the team first and talking to see what really happened, because he did not understand how it worked. Like, we went through and made sure that everything was chrooted. You couldn't go up or level, you couldn't go under a level, you couldn't do anything. All right, only thing you could do was go in there. You had access to specific folders. That was it. We made sure permissions were right. Everything was set up correctly. And we, as I told you, as a true developer, regardless of whether scripting or not, you should do unit testing. So right. I set up unit testing to make sure everything was tested. And if there was something that failed, then I would go back and fix it. So I knew that this could not happen. I knew the system. I built the system. And we come to find out now, there was one thing that we figured out that was a flaw and that we wasn't logging. But the whole mistake was that this could have cost us all our job. Because
especially to prematurely announce it to everyone, right?
right, not knowing what was really going on, and then when he found out that it wasn't on us, it was in the user error, which is what I told him. This happened. Only way this would happen would be user error, which I had specified before, and that's what happened. But we needed to figure out who did it,
right?
And we didn't have that basically instantiated in the logs to say who particularly from this IP address did it from that particular standpoint. So that's something we had to go back and do, so that way it wouldn't reoccur again like that anyway. So that was one good thing to come out of it, but we could have got fired. The next example that was a really crazy mistake was there was a guy that came in before him, an older guy who I had to teach the system and teach how to write code and stuff like that so he could get in there and administrate the system, because I was going to move on doing other things and I had another project. And I needed him to be able to do the stuff that we would do daily on a daily basis, and also be able to add extra features. So he had to understand how it worked and build the code. Now, there was one thing he did. There were several things that happened consistently, but there was one thing he did where it would not have been a user error. It was on him. It was another thing where data got put in the wrong place that could have been compromised and exposed. And that would be another HIPAA violation. And then we would be in really big trouble, which would have got him fired and would have got me in trouble because I was supposed to be managing him, making sure he did it. And he did screw up real badly. I told him what to do, what to check, how to do so. And he didn't do that. Luckily, I had to go and fix his mistakes because he did not set up everything properly. And there was a whole bunch of mistakes that could have been publicly exposed, public data. So I had to go through and fix that. But that was another mistake that could have cost, everybody their job. And that's one thing I don't think people understand in security, especially not only from a red team perspective, but blue team. You can lose your job in security. One day you can be on top of the hill, and then the next thing you're looking for a new job. So It's just not something you come in and play games. And I tell people, like, when you're getting into this, it's a serious stuff. This is not a game. This is not something you goof off with. And some people don't take that serious, that they just think, oh, I'm going to get in here and I'm going to do this and I'm going to be that and I'm going to get all this money. But you really have to be not only passionate, creative, and curious, but you have to take this serious. Like, if data get exposed and it's on your watch, you could lose your job, not only your job, but your reputation, and you might not even get another chance to be in the field at all if you were the one that caused this the organization to be compromised.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And we see a lot of examples of that throughout the industry. It's interesting because I don't think a lot of people recognize that they bear responsibility in this field. And so they're so busy trying to appease everyone else. And that's the big thing. I will tell you outright, one of the biggest personality flaws that will make it impossible for you to actually be good and successful and compliant and legal is being someone who avoids confrontation.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a big issue. But another thing I think people don't get on that end is you not only have to be strong-minded, but you kind of have to. You're gonna have to face diversity. Issues, confrontation. That's a part of our industry, especially as a security professional. You have to be able to deal with that. You also have to be sometimes the enforcer. You have to be able to speak your mind. You have to be able to stand your ground and not, basically just be complacent to what a developer or others think.
Right.
Especially if you believe something is truly an issue. Sometimes you can get scrutinized by it, but that comes with the territory.
Well, and to that point, you always have to be willing and able to back up your claims. So we've discussed where I've tangled with developers before, and it's stuff as simple as concurrency. and how the CPU and the compiler, etc., as well as the scheduler, are allowed to shift around instructions, right? So I've had developers who did not understand how that worked. And so we got into a discussion, and I had to sit there and supply actual examples and supply documentation from, in this case, it was C#, so it was Microsoft, and supply, in this case, IL, and things of that nature to back up what I was saying, along with actual factual examples. And I think a lot of people would capitulate instead, and that would be a horrible technical failure if you did. We knew several people at Highland, for example, who were quick to capitulate. Actually, they were very big on appeasing. I know another gentleman who works in a government organization as a contractor, and he does security control assessments, right? Well, this guy is the same exact mentality as those others. He is big on appeasing. No one's saying you want to be confrontational, right? Because that does not elicit good, positive responses. But what you have to be is willing to call someone to the carpet. And if called to the carpet, you have to be willing to go through and actually stand up for the truth, regulations, laws, guidelines, so on and so forth. And if you can't do that, this is definitely the wrong industry for you. Because just to give it a good example, so we had a gentleman who was going behind my back after I told him to disengage, and he kept working with this group. Well, I told him to disengage because he didn't know what he was doing, and he was getting sucked down a rabbit hole where they were consuming all of his time. Because, first of all, he didn't have the knowledge necessary. But more importantly, they were lacking a real project manager and were effectively using him to do their project management, which was wrong because we were supposed to be security. Well, why are we doing project management for a bunch of development teams, let alone a development team? That's not our job. But this guy went down that rabbit hole anyway, because that was the kind of person he was. He was big on avoiding confrontation and huge on appeasing people. Well, he wound up getting himself in a lot of trouble as a result. We got stuck doing stuff we should not for that team, and we could not reasonably for that team. Later on, to further things, after I got everything righted, he then was in a big management meeting that he shouldn't have been in for this particular team that had people high up in the company and high up on that team in on it. And he told them that they didn't need to do any more security work, that they were done, despite the fact that they had 9 critical and high vulnerabilities plaguing, and that's just vulnerability types plaguing their software. Hundreds of instances of these vulnerabilities, each one of these vulnerabilities across their software. And that was because he was so big on appeasing them that he did not want to tell management that there was still a lot more work to do. They had a year and a half at the pace they were going of work that they still needed to do. And that created a massive fight in the middle of that meeting, because a woman who was in charge of that group from a very high level perspective was sitting there going, that's not true. That can't be true. We have all of these findings still, and they haven't been resolved. Why are you telling everyone that they don't have any more security work to do? That wound up pulling me into the discussion. And I wasn't in the meeting. This guy, he and I did not get along because he wouldn't listen to me, which is how we wound up in this to begin with. But he came running to me, asking me to save him. Of course, it was my job, so I did. I didn't, I never sat there and used it against him or anything like that. But I went through and I saved him from it. We had to have a big, ugly discussion with the one woman. She was very, very upset, incredibly upset. And I managed to get everything set right. I left the organization shortly after, so I'm sure he continued to do his thing. And I'm sure he continues to do that kind of thing today. But that is a very bad mentality and a very bad personality for this field. You cannot shirk your responsibility because things are hard, or because someone got ugly, or because someone challenged you or your knowledge. You have to stick up for it.
And if you've done your research and your things ahead of time, there won't be any issues with that.
Oh, definitely.
Which some people don't. But to piggyback on another issue just from Highland, in a particular situation that management couldn't understand, that I learned, especially from you, is when it comes to reporting and vulnerabilities, you don't want to just oversaturate it. Mm-hmm. You don't want to. We're not here to beat up the client. We're here to help them. And that's why we do continuous assessments. But give like a 50 to 60 to 80 vulnerability report is ridiculous, which is what I had told management or the director at that time, that wasn't a good idea. And that all the client was, and especially developers, they were going to have any time, they would just scrap the project and move on to something else. And then that would leave clients or customers who are using this product with no answer to, the issues or vulnerabilities found, no solution. So they would still be using this vulnerable software while they're, making another one. So it's another thing that people need to understand, that, we're not here to beat up the client. We're here to help. That is our job. Our job is to help them find a way to remediate the issues, not to beat them up with a bunch of vulnerabilities. Say, hey, I'm awesome. Here you go, fix it. That's not solving the problem. That's not going to help. And why do they need you there when they can go and run a vulnerability scanner that can tell them the same goddamn thing? They might not be able to find all of the most complicated vulnerabilities, but some of the things that people are doing now, they're just using scanners anyway. Right. So what would make this, what would make it any different? They could just run a static analysis scan or dynamic analysis scan and get the vulnerabilities and then deal with the same shit. But that's why they hire professionals like us to be able to give them, solutions. And if they can't, use that particular solution, it's our job to come up with other ways that they can mitigate these issues.
Right. Well, and that's important. So some of the first reports I ever did 21 years ago, I would go through and I'd find just tons of issues. And I found very quickly that when you produce a report with 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 findings, that people shut down. It's too much. And that actually reared its ugly head again. Shortly after I joined Booz Allen, they had a big contract with NASA. And they were performing it was called CNA on a bunch of systems, actually all of the systems across the organization. And they wound up, the people who were doing this did not understand NASA. And so they took DoD security standards and applied it to a civilian agency. And there were a lot of findings. There were tons of findings. I mean, they were walking away with hundreds of findings. Hundreds. Every control was failed. And this is, of course, NIST Special Publication 853. Every control failed. Well, of course, every control failed. You're scanning them against the wrong set. They're not the DoD. You can't use DoD requirements and then map it over to NIST. It doesn't work that way. It's not that clean. It's not that clear. I actually wound up getting pulled in to take care of that. It was a huge debacle. NASA was going to pull the whole contract from Booz Allen, and I wound up going through and I got put in charge of the entire thing. So I was first put in charge of QA of everything to clean up all the findings. And then I was put in charge of running these SCAs, these assessments, all over the place across all of the different NASA centers. And that had me traveling quite a bit. But that goes back to something I mentioned earlier about management giving people the opportunity to recover from failure. In this case, the failure wasn't on me, but they'd already figured out quickly that I'm very good at fixing things, at cleaning things. And so they had put me on it to take care of everything from that regard. And that's why you have to understand the culture and mentality of whomever you're working with. And this doesn't matter what field you're in, but even within security. And first of all, nobody anywhere wants to see a bunch of findings. They shut down every time. And that's if you're auditing, that's if it's a vulnerability assessment, that's if it's penetration testing, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is you're doing. What you have to do, and this is where the trick and the beauty is, what you have to do is figure out how to encapsulate these findings into just a few example sets. And you push them into those groupings. And we've talked about that a little bit before. So I could hit someone on all of the different kinds of injection that they have, right? Or I could think about it, use my big meaty brain and say, I'm just going to hit them on insufficient input validation. And that covers all injection, server-side request forgery, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, LDAP injection, NoSQL injection, you name it. It's all in there, all of it. So I can do that and have a single finding. Now then the trick is describing it in such a way that it covers everything and then discussing it with the development team or whomever so that they understand what you're after. And you do that by giving a variety of examples that illustrate the point and then talking through mitigations. But so often people will fixate and they'll say, no, I have to do every single finding. You don't need to do every single finding. Not in that way, not specifically called out. And I mean, you did a report that had, 60-something findings?
Yeah.
And they scrapped it.
Yeah, they literally scrapped it. And I was thinking the same way you thought. It's different if you have a couple of injection vulnerabilities, but if you have like 10 injection vulnerabilities, then you might as well just group them together. And then you can lay out, even in the description, those different points for those different injections that you found. So you have your broad description, then you have the other descriptions explaining what really, what you found in that section, which makes it a lot easier because then you can give a couple of instances for each one of them if you would like. But really it tones it down so it doesn't really look like a huge report, but you're actually grouping everything together to make it easier for them to read and not feel like, oh my God, this is, first of all, think about it yourself. If you get a report and you have a ton of shit and you're like, oh my God, I don't even want to read this. It's like 80 vulnerabilities. Like, I don't want to read this. And then you got to think about it as a developer, and you've been a developer, or I'm still a developer. I was a developer. You're not gonna.
No.
Yeah, I'm not gonna want to touch that thing. I'm like, we might as well just start over from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what the hell is this? Like, we're not gonna be able to fix it, especially if you have a deadline. Because a lot of the times when they are getting a penetration tester, it's just trying to make sure they can meet their deadline. That before they put it out and publicly, that they are secure. So they have to do check box, right?
Right.
So that's the only reason why they're doing it anyway. Because half of the body wants anyway. They don't even want to hear they're insecure. Right. And then you have your other thing where developers, they love, this is their baby. They don't want you to tell them how bad they suck. So I mean, that's not, again, we're not here as consultants, pen testers, whatever you want to call yourself. We're not here to insult, belittle the client customer. We're here to help them understand that there is a problem and here's a solution. Give them a solution for mitigating those problems, and make it as simplistic or seamless as possible for them to be able to get these things accomplished, which makes you a way better or more valuable, I should say, not even way better, but makes you more valuable as a consultant. And, it gets people wanting to work with you more. It makes the client want to work with you because you helped them out in ways that they couldn't imagine. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, most people don't think about it that way. They're just like, hey, I'm here to, beat them down. I'm here to break everything. I'm awesome. And yeah, you may think you're awesome because you found 100 vulnerabilities, but to them, they're looking at you like, this guy is horrible.
Right. Like, you're stroking your own ego.
Yeah. That's not what we're here to do. That's not what, if you're in this field, this, especially if you're a consultant, that what is it? Like 90% reporting, 10%, is actually doing testing. And that's the truth, because the report is what makes the tester. You know what I'm saying? The way you report and the way you explain things that's the beauty of it.
Right.
And that's something I had to learn. When I first started, I was like, oh man, I want to kick ass. I want to get shells. I want to find every vulnerability as possible. But then I started thinking that I'm not going to find every vulnerability in a week. You know what I'm saying? But I want to make sure that I am efficient enough to give them what they need to be, to be more secure and more efficient. So my goal is to, make sure I explain everything and make sure I get, find enough things that I could help them with so they can find all of those aspects. We're not going to find every point, but they know their infrastructure better than we do, or their code. So they know where those issues are. Right. So you can group them, especially when it comes to endpoints. I don't have to say name out every endpoint and every vulnerable endpoint with this. I can just group them like you said.
In fact, actually, it's a huge mistake to go through and do that. And it's a very common mistake. I see it all the time. Because what happens is, if I go through and give an exhaustive list, or what appears to be an exhaustive list, they will fix those instances and only those instances. And they won't look to see where they have that same issue somewhere else. And that's another reason why being a little more broad in the discussion about what's going on is important and can help you. You may not have had time to go through and look for return to libc attack, for example. And they may still be vulnerable. But if your discussion doesn't open up the possibility that there are other vulnerabilities of this kind, and all you do is you hit them on remote code execution, well, they're going to look for what you specifically talked about. And if that remote code execution is specifically code injection, then they won't likely look for the fact that they have a return to libc vulnerability. They won't look for anything of that nature, nor would they look for anything that's similar, such as file injection and things of that nature, because it's not going to be on their mind. And as a result, you missed and they missed. And it is something that I learned quickly in just a few reports, but it's something that these big organizations don't seem to have learned. They're all still doing it, all of them. And I can't understand why. Even Booz Allen, after I left, that was one of the things I had helped create training for them and provided guidance and things of that nature. But shortly after I left, that they must have thrown it all out. Actually, I know exactly what happened because I talked to someone, and effectively the company, as part of their split, things kind of got lost. And so you'll see these massive reports. No one reads those massive reports, and it looks bad. It looks bad for everyone. Everyone hates them. And like we've discussed, there are ample instances where they have all these findings and all of the findings are wrong. So they have tons and tons of findings and none of them are worth anything. Well, why did I have you do anything if you didn't check and double check your report?
Yeah, that's a thing of mine. I kind of like to I keep checking over and over and over. And in rereading and making sure that this is, the person can understand and what I have is helpful to the client, especially when it comes to recommendations also. And then also just double checking my findings. Sometimes you may think you have something and then you really don't. And you don't want to make yourself look bad, because when you think about it as a consultant or a contractor, this is on you, just not only just the person you work for, but this is your reputation,
Right.
on the line. So if you're giving false positives or false negatives or different things, and you're not checking or double checking your work, then you could pretty much end up looking foolish, which could also cost you your job too, which is another big mistake.
Well, and to that point, so if we talk forensics, it's an even higher stakes game, especially if you're talking the actual digital forensics and not incident response. So I mentioned previously about an incident where we had someone and the government failed to do their due diligence, and they saw that the file was there and the timestamps on the file appeared to them to be accurate, but what they didn't check to see is whether or not that had been tampered with. And I found out that it had been tampered with, and that the file was in fact just 30 minutes before that system was shut down. The file was placed onto there. So it was a new file. But because they had tampered with it, it appeared to be significantly older, and it appeared to make the case. And that goes to the whole, you need to check and then double check. We talked about the engagement where Booz Allen claimed a system of ours had LDAP injection when there was no LDAP server. What they were hitting was a Solar backend, and it was responding like a search engine should, considering the input that they had provided. But Booz Allen had failed to double check the findings from wherever they got it. I'm going to assume it was an automated scan. That's because I can't imagine a manual scanner not doing basic checks for to ensure that LDAP injection is in fact LDAP injection. But that just goes to the point of you have to check, and check again. And if you aren't providing yourself the time necessary to do that, because your management won't, you have to carve it out of your own test schedule. But you'll have a lot of people that they're testing up until the very last day of the engagement, and you can't do that. You really can't.
And I guess that's what makes me pretty good at what I do. Because as I told you before, I described an instance where there was, we have a week assessment, and you have somebody doing 2 days worth of recon,
mm-hmm.
And I'm like, wow, like you'd wasted 2 days.
Yes. Where
it only took me 1 day. And then, to be honest, since I am a Nighthawk myself anyway, or vampire, I kind of like working at night anyway. That's when I'm more efficient, but I work all day. So I'll spend that whole day, I have some, Nmap scans going and, automating it, but it's multi-threading, and then looking for the things while I'm manually going through and looking at all my requests and scanning and, doing my different stuff. So in the day, I've kind of already finished the assessment.
Right.
Now I'm going to do sanity checks the rest of the week. So that way I can put everything together for, my report. But I'm doing sanity checks that whole week. And then sometime I may miss, go back and say, oh, okay, I missed something. Let me go back. I have time to check it out.
Right.
So that whole day I'm spending time really going through, trying to find the low-hanging fruits, trying to find more interesting things, manually checking things, looking for my checklist I always look for. But in that process, it gives me more time to find the critical things that people normally don't find, because they're spending a whole week just doing recon. And then the last day is when they're actually doing something.
Yes, that's exactly right. So time management, I think, is one of the bigger skills that you wind up having to learn. And if you don't learn that, then you're going to fall flat on your face over and over and over again. You have to learn that you're never going to find everything. It's not going to happen. So instead, you have to do targeted scans and then targeted manual checking. And you have to analyze the data and use your intelligence, which is something that scanners can't give you. and say, okay, well, based on what I'm seeing here, this is the kind of thing that I see in general. And this is where watching people who do know, watching your seniors who do know what they're doing would be an invaluable lesson, and something that I think a lot of people these days are missing because they want to be seen as this super hacker. And so they don't want to watch someone else or ask questions, or on the opposite end, all they do is ask questions. So they never get any practical experience. You have to go through and do this stuff yourself, and you need to pay attention to what you're seeing, what customers are saying and thinking, and try to learn each and every time. Because if you don't, you're going to be doomed to repeat it. And you're going to be, like I said in my prior example, Booz Allen, where the customer is threatening to take away the contract because you've hosed it up so badly. Really, the first engagement I had where I was put on the ground, I was doing my thing, and I was talking to one of the system administrators, and I was saying, look, you guys have a lot of, in general, findings, and a lot of it's because you're being held to ridiculous standards that shouldn't be the case. And we opened up that dialogue. And my immediate recognition that something was amiss is what wound up saving things on my side, which then catapulted me into becoming the guy who was in charge of ensuring everything went okay, to being the guy who was running it all from a technical perspective. And all that was me paying attention, saying something is clearly very wrong, and listening to the customer and listening to the client, and then moving forward. And you have to be able to talk, and you have to be able to talk in a way that they can understand. And so often you'll get these security guys who can't, and they will never do well. They will never do well.
So to recap on that, basically, you definitely have to be able to deal with conflict and not be complacent just because, or as you said, trying to please, the client or the customer just because, they give you a little pushback. That comes with, with the territory in this field. Also, you want to focus more on, helping the client remediate vulnerabilities and then trying to belittle them or, beat them up. That's not what we're here for. That's not our job as consultants, contractors, whatever part of security you're in. That's not the main job. The job is you have a problem and you need to come up with a solution. And that's what we do.
Right.
In all aspects of the field.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah, conflict resolution is very important, and that is different than conflict avoidance.
Yeah.
Completely different. And if you screw up technically, like you create a minor denial of service on some part of the network, or if you do worse and take it all down, you need to be able to talk with the individuals and explain it, because the truth is we all make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. And most people are willing to understand that, so long as you address that you made a mistake and discuss then learn how to pull the positives out of it and discuss how you can prevent it in the future, or how it was important that this mistake was detected now, and that kind of thing. What you don't want is to get kicked out of an engagement or off some work and tick management off or anything like that. But like I said, that's different than conflict avoidance. It's different than running with your tail between your legs.
And another big thing to piggyback off of that is learn, basically accountability.
Yeah.
You learn to take accountability, like for your actions, like you screw up, you screw up. But, it's not about throwing people under the bus, as we said, as I pointed out at IBM. It's not about throwing your teammates under the bus and, saying crazy things about them.
Right.
You need to discuss that internally. But, don't be so immature about things. Just take accountability for your actions. Things going to happen, And when they do, you just need to, like you said, take the positives. There's some negatives, but take the positive out of that and explain to the client what really happened and how they can fix it. But you got to be able to take accountability for your actions. If you're not going to take accountability for your actions, like you've seen at Highland, then it's going to be a whole mess. And it's going to be bad for the team as a whole.
Right. That's exactly right. It'll be bad for everyone.
Yeah. So you don't want to make your team look bad, and you don't want to make yourself look.
So hopefully we've given you a little purview into just some of the failures, technical failures that we've seen or had on our end, or interactions, so on and so forth, and then how we managed to adjust it. I know this was very high level. This is very broad. We're going to actually have some storytelling times in the future where we'll delve into this a little further. So maybe you'll garner some of the specifics of it, or some specific tactics. But on the other side, hopefully you can take some of the advice that we've given you as to how to prevent some of these failures in the first place, or how to handle them should they occur. And the real crux of the whole thing is communication and understanding how to properly communicate. And that is vital to our field. It doesn't matter if we're talking reports, or how you host something, or resolving some issue. It's communication.
Yeah. Communication is key. Well, that is our time. I am Roniel.
I am DaRon.
And thank you for joining in or tuning in to the Roniel podcast show. Please, if you haven't already, like and subscribe to our channel for more episodes coming up in the future. And this is our time. Thank you.
Have fun.